Class, as we all know, NATO started the war in Ukraine. Russia was simply an innocent victim forced into action.
That's crazy. Russia literally invaded Ukraine after promising it would never invade. How is that NATO's fault?
Well, if you read something other than Western propaganda, then you would already know the answer.
Professor, rather than coming up with cheap ad hominem attacks, can you please answer his question?
All right, then. Look, NATO had an agreement with Russia that they wouldn't ever expand eastward, and yet they kept breaking that agreement over and over again, and that angered Russia.
Professor, that is just factually incorrect. NATO never had an agreement or a treaty with Russia that they wouldn't expand eastward. That is pure mythology.
Okay, smarty pants, maybe there was no written agreement, but Russia did have a verbal agreement with NATO that they wouldn't expand eastward.
I'm sorry, Professor, but you are also wrong about that. There never was even a verbal agreement with NATO that they wouldn't expand eastward. That is just factually wrong.
Well, you're getting overly picky with your wording here. Of course there was no agreement between NATO directly and Russia. The agreement was between U.S. Secretary of State James Baker and Russia back in 1990.
Wait a minute, you've already changed your position like 3 or 4 times now. Would you make up your mind? Which is it?
I have not changed my position. I am just trying to dumb things down so that you brainwashed people can follow along.
Really? First, you said NATO started the war and broke an agreement with Russia. Then you admitted there was no written agreement. Then you said there was no verbal agreement with NATO either. And now you're saying it was James Baker in 1990. Which is it, Professor?
Baker made a verbal deal with Russia in 1990 on behalf of NATO. It wasn't made directly with NATO, but it's basically the same thing.
This is absurd. Baker did not represent NATO, and in no way did he speak on behalf of NATO. In addition, Baker's discussions in 1990 were with the Soviet Union, not Russia. That's a big difference.
It doesn't matter if it was the Soviet Union or not. For all we know, maybe the Soviets thought Baker was a dual agent representing both NATO and the US.
This whole theory is starting to sound completely insane. If this so-called agreement with Baker was real and that important, then why didn't they just make a formal treaty?
Well, probably they trusted Baker, and they felt they didn't need a treaty because he would follow through on his promise.
So under your theory, the Soviets believed that Baker would live forever, and they didn't need a treaty because they could always ask Baker what he meant between then and the end of time?
Professor, I gotta tell you, the more I hear about your Russia-NATO agreement theory, the more it sounds like pure nonsense. That's not the way the real world works.
Hold on. Maybe they thought Baker's words were so clear they didn't even need a written agreement.
You're joking, right? Please tell me you're joking.
No, I'm not joking. Why would you say that?
Most scholars agree Baker was only talking about German reunification and troop limits. Only fringe propagandists twist it into a NATO-wide promise.
Well, Baker's words are very complicated. It all depends on the context. The meaning isn't easy to decipher. They could mean different things.
Professor, you just refuted your own point.
How do you figure?
First, you said Baker's words were so clear they didn't need a treaty. Now you say they're complicated and open to interpretation.
Well, let me think about that one and get back to you.
Professor, consider this. James Baker wrote a 600-page memoir about the diplomacy of those years. Not once does he mention any so-called verbal deal with Russia. If this agreement really existed, wouldn't Baker have at least brought it up in his own book?
Well, maybe the CIA threatened to kill him if he ever wrote about it.
Professor, with all due respect, now you're really starting to sound a little unhinged.
And there are no letters from Baker to NATO about this so-called deal. NATO never changed its charter, and the Soviets never even asked them to. This whole theory about a supposed deal between Baker and the Soviets is pure mythology, involving statements taken out of context.
Well, maybe Baker and the Soviets just got really busy and forgot to tell NATO about the deal they made for them.
So you're saying they made a deal that bound NATO forever, but nobody bothered to tell NATO? Are you serious?
Well, that's just my theory. I wasn't there, and I don't know for sure.
Well, let's talk about someone who was there. Are you familiar with Mikhail Gorbachev?
Of course. He was the last president of the Soviet Union and directly involved in those talks.
So you agree that if anyone knew what was discussed then, it would be Gorbachev?
Yes. Nobody on the Soviet side would know more than Gorbachev.
And you'd also agree that if anyone had a complaint about breaking a deal, verbal or otherwise, it would be Gorbachev, right?
Of course, he would be the first person to complain if a deal was broken, since he was involved in the discussions and agreements.
Great. Then here's what Gorbachev said in a 2014 interview, also on YouTube. The topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in those years.
Professor, I think your NATO agreement theory has just been completely debunked.
The crazy verbal NATO agreement theory where NATO doesn't know about it and the people who were there deny there was an agreement or even discussions about limiting NATO, right? That makes perfect sense.
Well, maybe the ex-Soviet leader forgot about the agreement. Or maybe the CIA threatened his life if he didn't say what they wanted him to say. Who really knows?
Or maybe this so-called NATO agreement theory was something that was invented years later as a pretext to invade Ukraine and justify stealing land and killing innocent people.